Can you talk a little bit about some of the practical issues related to inclusivity that we have observed with our partners or helped our partners with?
So when we're talking about the employee experience, there's so many factors that contributes to kind of the day-to-day experiences of the employees. And from an inclusivity standpoint, you have to be able to look at some of those indicators and then figure out how inclusive are we, or from the employee side, how do they feel that they're being sought out?
I feel like communication comes up often in our podcasts that we've done and in the work that we do every day. It's such a critical piece that relates to everything else. And I think it's maybe kind of an easy concept, but gets overlooked a lot. Like, you should communicate with your employees. And sometimes we look at the challenges and where there's mistrust or a sense of being excluded, and like it could be relatively quickly addressed through thoughtful communication, both in terms of on the front end being like asked to give input, right? That's a form of communication and transferring understanding, right, to someone. So the people that are impacted by your decisions, are you asking them for their input? Welcome to the Workforce Success Podcast, brought to you by Mwano Consultancy. My name is Andrea, and I'm here with Deo, and we are here to bring you relevant content around culture and climate work that will hopefully help you improve the culture within your organization and maximize your positive impact. And today we're going to unpack one of our 7 principles. Our 7 principles is a series of concepts that we use with our partners to help them improve their culture and climate. And we help them come up with ways that each principle is practical and relevant to the work that they're doing and the positive improvements that they're seeking to create in their environment. And today we're unpacking inclusivity. So let's get into it.
Hello, Andrea.
Hello. So Deo, can you start by defining inclusivity and talking a little bit about how that concept impacts culture, why it's important to discuss when we're doing culture work with our partners?
Great. Yeah. So when we talk about inclusivity, we really mean a place where people see themselves and everything that they bring in terms of their identity, who they are, identity in terms of externally, internally, feeling a sense of belonging, and being able to feel respected. And inclusivity is really about people being able to see themselves within the broader community that they're in, and that they see that there's an opportunity for them to be sought out, included, but more importantly, being brought into the picture with who they are without feeling any form of discrimination or separation. So when we work with our partner, we work with them in order for them to come up with their own definition of what inclusivity means in their respected community.
Now, in recent years, we've seen the concept of the employee experience, or EX, emerge as a really pivotal factor in HR practices. Can you talk a little bit about how inclusivity relates to the employee experience and why that's really important for all employers to be mindful of in this climate?
Yes, so we've seen over the years when it comes to employee experience, the concept of DEI, which means diversity, equity, and inclusion, became fully integrated within the last couple of years, especially after the George Floyd murder. But the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion has been around for a very long time, even during the civil rights era, and different changes that's happened within the workforce space, workers' right with gender and different race and all of that. It's always been part of HR and human service within an employee and an employer relation. Over the years, it's continuing to build a lot of momentum, but we really saw it become more catapult after George Floyd's murder, because employers started to recognize that there were certain impact that impacted different groups and identity differently, and they wanted to make sure that within their organization that they were being intentional. But the employee experience always exists, right? Because when we talk about employee experiences, an experience that an individual has within an employer that they work with. Mm-hmm. And there's different factors that contributes to those experiences. So some are more based on task and responsibility. So when you're out doing your work, what does that entail of? Some are based on the social aspects. So some stuff might be off the cuff or what's expected. You know, there's policies and code of conduct. And most recently, it's had more intentionality around certain principles like people's identities and how it plays out within the work on an everyday basis. But it's a really critical thing to think about and to consider and to have a robust strategy, because the experiences that your employees have, it's more than just them, the transaction of them getting a paycheck at the end of the week. It's actually about the day-to-day experience. So if you are looking into that and you're examining it, then you're able to identify things that you're doing that's well, that employees are resonating with them, and then maybe things where you're doing that needs to be adjusted or changes because it's impacting the employees negatively. And so I mentioned the George Floyd thing, but I also want to mention the negative impact that came out of during the pandemic, because we realized that some employees had flexibility of working from home. Some employees were part of our frontline workforce, and there was some clear indication that some of those employees have been overlooked for so long. And during the pandemic, we saw a lot of the hard work that they did. And then the whole notion of employee experience became even greater, because in certain industry, some employees decided that they didn't want to work for those industries anymore because they moved to maybe a more rural area that was less city, because they wanted more space to breathe. During the pandemic time, they finally had a chance to reflect about their personal life, their work life, and realize that maybe certain things didn't align, and they left. All of a sudden, employers were reminded, hey, you need to really pay attention on your overall employee experience. If not, it's impacting retention, where there was a mass turnover where people were leaving their companies. So employee experience is a really big thing, and it's important for employers to be in the forefront of it.
Right. I mean, I think that there's been some growing trends in terms of what employees expect out of their employer, and I've seen also how the job market can influence the necessity for an employer to care about the employee experience too, right? If there's a lot of job openings and not enough people to fill the jobs, for example, then the power is more on the side of the job seeker and the employee. And if you're an organization, you need to be aware of that climate, and it behooves you to pay attention to what it is that your current employees and the employees that you are seeking to attract, what they are looking for from you, and how to make sure that they're feeling a sense of belonging that's making them want to stay. And then on the other side, sometimes you see when the employer has the power, so to speak, sometimes inclusivity and employee-centric policies tend to take a less priority because they can afford to do that because people need the jobs. Can you talk a little bit about some of the practical issues related to inclusivity that we have observed with our partners or helped our partners with?
Yes, I always bucket it in either from a operational standpoint, from a compensation standpoint, from a benefit standpoint, from a social standpoint, from upscaling. So when we're talking about the employee experience, there's so many factors that contributes to kind of the day-to-day experiences of the employees. And from an inclusivity standpoint, you have to be able to look at some of those indicators and then figure out how inclusive are we, or from the employee side, how do they feel that they're being sought out? Do they feel that there's a sense of belonging for them? So with our partners, we always look at bottom line, right? So the bottom line is always, is this place a place where people see themselves? It doesn't necessarily mean that they see other people that are them. It just means that what they bring in is a reflection of who they are, or they can fully be themselves and without feeling judgment or any form of exclusion. So then you benchmark it across all the experience that an employee has, right? So when you look at incentives, when you look at training opportunity, when you look at consideration, recognition, right? All of those things reflects how an employee feel. So with our partners, we're very explicit when it comes to identifying certain data points in order to indicate where the employees are. So some of it we start with some qualitative or quantitative information gathering that ask very explicit questions like, do you feel a sense of belonging here? Do you feel respected? Do you feel that you can be your true self while you're at work? And so some of those questions, depending on how it's answered, will indicate a lot of how employees perceive themselves within their work environment. And then we look at other stuff. So we look at from an operational standpoint. Even sometimes we look at departments, right? We say, hey, if you look at in terms of upscaling and promotion, how is that across all your departments? Are there opportunity for all your departments for people to move up, to have more opportunity? And sometimes you don't wait until you interview someone to get a sense of that, because a lot of that stuff is being captured from the HR system on the background. So you can tell through data a lot too what level of that looks like, because you can look at data points like across the last 6 months or 12 months, what department has promoted folks internally, who are the folks that are getting promoted, right? Mm-hmm. So you can benchmark that against demographic data as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's any form of exclusion happening, but if the data is telling a certain story, then it creates an opportunity to dive deeper in order to figure out why are we only seeing these type of employees getting promoted versus that type of employees, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then the other side is also in communication. We work with employers that have different types of employees, where some employees work in front of a laptop or a computer on a daily basis. A lot of the communication channel nowadays are coming through those channels, like a technology tool like a Slack or a Microsoft Team or an email, where certain employees that might be on the front line might not be in front of their computer often, right? Mm-hmm. So then we look at that. How inclusive are you thinking about your communication strategies? There's been partners where we've helped them put TVs all over, so employees that are not looking at a computer on a daily basis, they can see important information going through a slideshow in traffic areas. Mm-hmm. Posters that are hung up, reminders, right? So that inclusivity piece is so critical to look at not in a vacuum, but within your overall operational approach. And then the other side of it is also on identities. We know that our society at times influence a lot of the ways that our workforce also operates, right? There's still pay gaps between genders, race, and so many different categories. So if all of those things are accounted for, it's really important to look at those things internally in order to see if those are factors or not. And I know that's very sensitive with many of the partners we work with and partners that we've worked with in the past, because once you start digging into the HR data, then some stuff might be it might be a work lawsuit if you look at certain data and it's only telling a certain thing. So folks are very apprehensive sometimes to dig into their own database because they don't know what the story it will tell.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the point you made for a minute about communication, because I feel like communication comes up often in our podcasts that we've done and in the work that we do every day. It's such a critical piece that relates to everything else. And I think it's something that it's maybe kind of an easy concept, but gets overlooked a lot. Like, you should communicate with your employees. And sometimes we look at the challenges and where there's mistrust or a sense of being excluded, and like it could be relatively quickly addressed through thoughtful communication, both in terms of on the front end being like asked to give input, right? That's a form of communication and transferring understanding, right, to someone. So the people that are impacted by your decisions, are you asking them for their input? You know, not only is it considerate, you know, you get the value of their perspective and the ones, you know, closest to the work, being able to give you information that you might not have. If you're a decision maker, you tend to be a little bit further removed from the actual day-to-day of some of the work. And then on the back end, looping people into why decisions are made or what the plan is going to be. And those are very simple ideas, right? It's a very simple action that I think gets missed a lot, and it causes people to feel excluded when otherwise, sometimes they're not excluded. Sometimes leaders are working off over here, trying to fix their employee experience, and they're doing all these new things, but the employees don't necessarily know. And they think, oh, they don't care about us, they're not interested in our experience, and that might not be the case.
Yeah, you are so right on that. A lot of our solution, once we start unpacking and identifying where areas of gaps are, a lot of times it does definitely start with communication. And we take for granted a lot of the information that we might be accustomed to. And that's from the lens of maybe a director, a supervisor, a manager, or an employee where the communication is based on their preferences and their accessibility. But when we don't consider all the different moving parts of our organization or company, we might completely exclude certain folks in the way that we communicate. And that's why it's important to always have a very robust strategy when it comes to your inclusivity implementation, because if you can close the gap in that area, then at least everyone has an opportunity to get the information. Mm-hmm. And then they have to figure out what they do with the information after it's shared with them, to figure out how they utilize resources or opportunity that's given within internally. And sometimes that also requires accessibility in the modes in which the communication is shared. Mm-hmm. Looking at maybe perhaps languages. That we've had partners that have very diverse employee groups that speak multiple languages, and so you have to be aware of that. So maybe sometimes certain vernaculars, right? We might all speak English, but the vernaculars that we use or synonyms or analogies that we use, it might not resonate with certain folks. So it's really important to be able to recognize that. Mm-hmm. And then part of it is validation. We talk a lot about validation in our work. You want to make sure that what's being conveyed, the intention of the message, is actually being received in the way that you're wanting to present it. And the way to do that is validating. Mm-hmm. Being able to go back to the folks to see, did you get the information? Did it make sense? Are you on the same page? What does that look like, right? And I think in the workforce space, sometimes that feels like busy work. Mm-hmm. We go into these solutions with our preconceived notion already that if we do it, then people are engaging with it and they're good to go. You can only attest to that if you validate. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the work that we do when we're doing listening sessions with some of our partners, it could be a really amazing intervention or solution that one of our partner implements. And then we're on the ground level and the employees say something completely different. We're like, you benefited from that. Mm-hmm. That's where it came from. Oh, I didn't know that. I just thought that was, no, that's where it came from. Oh, okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Right. I didn't know. So,
but what's so important about that is their perceptions are their reality. Mm-hmm. And the beliefs that they hold about how much their voice matters or is being heard or taken into consideration, that impacts their level of confidence. It impacts their engagement. It impacts, their attitude towards the work they're doing, towards leadership. So it can seem like an added step, or it can seem extra or time consuming, but it directly impacts the quality of the work that's happening and the satisfaction and engagement of your employees. And so it's really critical step to take, and think of the time lost and the quality of the work that could suffer, that's impacted by the false perceptions that someone might have because there wasn't clear, intentional communication.
I definitely agree. I think if it's a good size organization, you definitely want to have a comp strategy internally. Mm-hmm. On a daily basis, sometimes weekly basis. And if you don't have the resources to have someone specifically dedicated to that, then you want to find someone that can oversee it, even if they have other responsibility. Because it's always going to be ongoing because, and that's a big part of it. And I also think that inclusivity, there's two sides of it. There's the preconceived notion that employees have about how they perceive certain things, but there's also just the reality of how you operate. It might be a legacy organization where certain employee experiences been done a certain way for so long, and those who've been successful, maybe it's been through other factors and incentives that your organization provides. So it might be the technology that you're creating, or it might be the reputation of the organization. And the bottom line is also might just be the compensation, the benefits and salary of employees. Mm-hmm. So that's been the driver for so long. It doesn't really give people a lot of time to reflect and say, hey, how are we showing up? Mm-hmm. But nowadays, folks have become a little bit more empowered in how they think about their experience within their employer. Mm-hmm. And they're going to make the move. I really believe that even now in 2024, it's still very much so an employee's market. Mm-hmm. And we've seen this across working with city employers that are more in metro area, and also the ones that we've seen in a more urban area outside of the city that are more in rural areas, where you might think that because they're a little bit more spread out, that they might be more sensitive in their approach and how they retain their job. Even now, folks are still sizing up their employer. And then if you are in a busier area, the gig economy is right here. Mm-hmm. Some folks are willing to, and I'm not trying to hate on anyone that does this, but if it's an Uber or DoorDash or whatever it is, but some folks are willing to do that just so they feel at peace, and they also feel that they have control. Mm-hmm. And so part of that inclusivity strategy, you have to also consider that, because if not, you're going to have a revolving door where people come in, people leave, people come in. You might have folks in your workforce that have been dedicated, but eventually those folks are going to end up retiring. And when those folks start retiring, then you're back at it again. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have a good succession plan that considers inclusivity as part of that strategy, then you're operating from a deficit. And then I also think that when we look at other factors like people's identity, ethnicity, religion, or all the other things that people how they make sense of the world based on their identity, those are also a factor, right? And part of it is to just I think being sensitive, it's okay to be sensitive to other people's culture, ethnicity, all the different categories, because the sensitivity hopefully will inform you in being humble, but also have humility to be able to disclose that, hey, I don't know what I don't know. Mm-hmm. And our company and our organization still has some learning to do. We're going to take the right measure for us to learn and how to be in a company that maybe that's culturally diverse or whatever it is, mm-hmm. right? And I think that humbleness is so important, because a lot of times what we hear in a lot of our work, people say, oh, we're not this. Mm-hmm. So whatever the negative narrative that might be associated to a certain perspective and point of view, but they miss that it's the action, right? It's the action, the behavior that might be telling a different story. So right. If you have someone that comes in with a different identity that might be underrepresented and are saying, hey, I feel uncomfortable sometimes, or I feel this, you have to make sure that your HR team has a really good, robust approach to want to unpack what's occurring, and having safe spaces for employees to be able to express that. Mm-hmm. Because part of it is to uncover how those individuals might feel. Mm-hmm. And that can go by a lot of different things. It can even be by gender, or it could be a non-binary person that comes in a more cis environment and feels that maybe people make jokes, that they think it's funny, but those jokes, the undertone of it might be homophobic, or the jokes might be sexist or discriminatory or racist, whatever the thing is. Yeah. And so part of it is when you have that humility, then you're coming at it from a learning mindset, because there's certain spaces that have had legacy behavior that's been accepted, that's been normalized, and never been confronted. That's the other word, is confronted. Because if it's never been confronted, people might normalize that. They might just say, oh, that's how we are. We don't really mean this. That's not who we are. That was just a joke, you know?
Right.
And then someone comes into that space and they're like, whoa, like, I feel targeted here. You know, I don't feel like I can fully express myself. For instance, we've had partners that we've worked with, even on the pronoun side, where there's certain pronouns that people want to be referenced to, but because we're not used to those type of pronouns, like for instance, if someone wants to be identified as a they, right? Like it might be a little bit of a tongue twist for you to refer that person by they, because you've always, from a external physiology, your brain might connect that person to a different noun and you're used to saying it, you know, normally. And it might take time for you to adjust, but when you do drop the ball and say the wrong pronoun referencing that person, you have to take ownership and say, hey, I'm sorry. I'm still learning and I'm having a hard time. But if I continue to say it at times, I want you to correct me, right? So I'm being more specific on like where the friction of inclusivity might occur for those who might be underrepresented in a space, for those who actually might be part of the majority to be able to drive that. And I think that vulnerability piece around leading with humility around inclusivity when it comes to those categories is really important, because at least folks will know what your intents are instead of bypassing it.
Right. And this work can feel, what you're describing is kind of an uncomfortable process. It takes humility and vulnerability, and it can feel risky to kind of confront the reality of, regardless of your intentions, what's actually happening to people that might be in the minority in one way or another. And actually, we've seen recently like the narrative around DEI work kind of becoming a little more negative. It's facing criticisms. I don't know if you'd call it DEI fatigue or how you would describe that, but you know, people are kind of almost souring to the idea and the efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners. I'm curious, why do you think that is, and what would you suggest people who are in that work and trying to improve the culture in their organizations do to respond?
I think there's been a lot of factors that have contributed to that. I also think that some of the drivers are just folks don't like to feel guilty. And that, when I say folks, I also mean myself. Like, we don't like to operate from a guilty point of view because we don't like those feelings. And I feel like within the last couple of years, with DEI being in the forefront and tools and all these resources and the teaching, some folks have found themselves on the receiving end of those guilt, either intentionally or unintentionally, but feeling uncomfortable that they feel like they have an upper hand, or they're unintentionally perpetuating certain behaviors that might exclude others. And the fact that it's been in the forefront for a good amount of time now, the drivers that might contribute to the negative behavior, some people might see themselves through that, and they don't like seeing themselves through it. So they might justify and say, oh, but no, that's not what I mean, or that's not who I am. Or they might justify and combat it by looking at areas where they themselves might be underrepresented or marginalized. And then they use that narrative as their undertone to go against whoever that's trying, or whatever group that's trying to be represented around an experience. So I feel that because our society was so receptive of DEI, it almost silenced a lot of folks that were on the other end of the marginalization, meaning that they were the one potentially being targeted as perpetuators of marginalizing others. So it silenced them because the masses agreed with these ideology from the employer, from the schools, right? Even churches, communities, right? And so you find yourself isolated in this corner where you're like, oh man, like, I don't really I don't really like the way I feel. And for some people, they didn't really want to spend a lot of time to reflect on what it meant for them than it is them putting their walls up and saying, oh, I'm not that. So therefore, or don't they also see what I'm going through or the challenges that I face in this society as a BB, you can make it whatever example you want. Mm-hmm. So then all of a sudden, certain things that started playing out at a grander scale that might have isolated others, and there were gaps and loopholes. So what they ended up doing was, once the opportunity was presented, they said, ooh, this is my time to advocate for myself. So we saw that in the college space, right? Like a couple of months ago, some of the Ivy League presidents were at a hearing, and they were put in the spot to answer a certain question. They answered the question a certain way. Folks didn't like the way they answered the questions. Those who controlled some of the donations that those schools received put a lot of pressure, like Bill Ackman, who is a big investor, went to Harvard and gave a bunch of money to Harvard, was one of the person that was very vocal around this. So you saw that pressure. And then the other thing was, when these organizations made certain decisions that changed the course, it built more momentum for others to feel, oh yeah, I've also disagreed with these PC politically correctness in whatever form that they were advocating for. And then you've seen the last couple of months, it's almost been this dynamic shift, paradigm shift around. All of a sudden, DEI is the bad thing instead of the other way around. And I think some of those things are just natural in our human society. And the unfortunate part is, those arguments are usually projected within the front facing instead of the undertone, the drivers that are driving the areas where we all have an opportunity to grow in and how we see one another as human beings, And that's what inclusivity is really about. It's about seeing each other and looking at each other as honorable human beings that deserve a chance to exist and seek the same opportunity that every employee has within an employer's community, So the unfortunate part is that everything goes in a cycle. And I think if we focus so much on the principle of DEI itself and the attack of it, then we're bypassing the root of it, which is really about representation and people feeling a sense of belonging.
Yeah, ironically, it's about being able to have differing opinions and experiences and to look at those and address those in a respectful way where everyone's unique perspective and voice is considered, and being able to coexist with those different perspectives.
Oh, 100%. And I think as humans, we're always going to have to put an effort to continue to learn and improve of how we treat one another and how we see one another. And so that also permeates within the work environment. If you have autonomy, if you don't have autonomy, if you have influence, right? What does that influence look like around your team? What does that influence look like when you're a supervisor or when you're tenured? You've been there longer than other people and you have some, so that's really what inclusivity comes back down to. Yes, it could be used and leverage in a certain way, but at the end of the day, it's the employer's job and responsibility to make sure that they are being intentional in how they go about determining that experience for everyone. And then it's also important for the employers to have policies and procedure in place to address issue when it comes up, even if it doesn't meet their bottom line. Because those who are on the receiving end of those negative behaviors, they watch and see. And those who are not on the receiving end also watch and see in order to see what is permitted in how they show up. If someone has a bad day and if they see that, hey, somebody got away with a certain thing, that might perpetuate them to say something where it might have not been appropriate because they feel like, oh, there's really not a lot of consequences here. So inclusivity is always going to be an ongoing thing that employers have to put in the forefront when they think about their employees' experience, regardless if the term DEI is there or not, or whatever the latest term that people are going to end up using.
Right. Whatever you're calling it, the work still has to be done.
100%.
It's going on right now. Your culture is what it is. It's about how you treat your employees, how they treat each other, and it's happening one way or another, and you have to address it.
And that's actually one of the reasons why I don't even, even the attack on DEI, it doesn't really faze me and bother me for someone who is in the space of culture and experience for employees, because the problems themselves will still occur.
Right.
Regardless of what category you put it in, because these issues are human being issues within a work environment. They could be human being issues within a school environment, human being issue within a community environment. It's the employee experience, it's the human experience within an ecosystem. Yes, the ecosystem has a transactional relationship where there's certain tasks and duty we have to do. In return, we get compensated, but we still show up as human being in those spaces. As long as we show up as human being in those spaces, we're always going to have to wrestle with our intention, but also how we see one another.
Absolutely. I think that's a good place to end for today. Definitely a conversation that could keep going and should keep going. But for our listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you found this content interesting and relevant, please share it with a colleague and subscribe for more.